Today we're going to look at Standard 5. Standard 5 includes the United States moving into interventionism or imperialism, and also includes World War I. So, isolationism to interventionism, these two very different foreign policies. So in the 19th century or the 1800s, the United States focused on isolationism. And this meant relative neutrality in terms of global affairs and conflicts. So we're avoiding conflict with other nations, okay, whenever we can. All right, that's going to change as we're going into the 20th century or the 1900s. We're going to start moving towards interventionism. So with this, we are engaging other nations to promote U.S. national interest. Okay, so we're getting involved in other countries to promote U.S. national interest, and what that means is either expanding our territory, expanding markets, getting more natural resources, providing for a stronger military or defense. All of those are possible reasons why we might engage in another nation as interventionists. So motivations for American imperialism. And these aren't in any particular order of importance. Social Darwinism. So Europeans and Americans believed that their civilization was superior to those of Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. So they believed that because their civilization was superior and others were inferior, that they had the right. They had the right to intervene in these different places around the world. And they thought that this would benefit the different peoples that they were coming in contact with. Okay, next we have the expansion of markets. So imperialism opened foreign markets for American agricultural and industrial products, easing economic tensions at home. So if you guys remember, we talked about how overproduction was happening, especially in manufacturing and agriculture in the U.S. economy. So we needed new markets to sell these goods because we had more than we needed. Next, we have the spread of Christianity and Western civilization. American imperialists had convinced themselves that they had an obligation referred to as the white man's burden to spread Christianity and elevate subject peoples while exploiting them economically. So we thought we were helping them in terms of bringing them Western civilization. Next are naval bases, and this is part of the defense. America sought to assert itself as a naval power. In the early 20th century, imperialism provided the United States with naval bases in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Although American imperialism established the United States as a world power and spread American political, economic, and religious ideals, it also provoked resentment from people who were subject to American domination, especially in the Philippines and Cuba, and we'll talk about why that is. So the Spanish-American War marked the United States' emergence as a world power. This is happening in 1898. So the causes of this: Cuba was a territory of Spain and it wanted independence. So American sympathy for rebels in Cuba who were fighting against Spain for their independence. Next is the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. That ship was there to kind of observe and protect American interest in Cuba while that rebellion was going on. It exploded, and newspapers in the United States blamed the Spanish for blowing it up. even though we're pretty sure that it was an accident and it was not Spain. So that brings us to yellow journalism. New York City newspapers published sensational headlines in order to compete for circulation. Many of those sensational headlines were about the plight of the Cuban people, as well as the explosion of the USS Maine, blaming Spain. These factors resulted in public pressure on the U.S. government to declare war on Spain. And they had this catchy slogan, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." So the war happens. America wins and inherits what's left of Spain's colonial empire. So Spain is forced to give the United States the Philippines, or at least to sell them to us, as well as Guam. Both of these are in the Pacific. And then in the Caribbean, we get Puerto Rico, which is still a U.S. territory today. And then Cuba will get its freedom, will get its independence. So we got a free Cuba, and I put that in quotations because it's going to be a protectorate of the United States. So that even though it's independent, the United States is going to have a lot of influence over it. Okay? The Supreme Court ruled at the time that the Constitution does not follow the flag, and that people in American overseas territories were not and did not have the same constitutional rights as people living people living on the North American continent. So basically, they were not equal citizens. They weren't the same under the law or the Constitution. So the United States mercilessly crushed a rebellion in the Philippines. The Filipino people did not want to be annexed. They wanted to be free like Cuba. The United States decided against that and annexed them, and they rebelled. So imperialist arguments for the annexation of the Philippines. They argued Filipinos were incapable of self-government. And of course, they believed this due to the racism of the time period. And anti-imperialists, people who were against the annexation of the Philippines, they believed that doing so went against American values. So basically, if we annex these people who do not want to be annexed by us, how can we talk about liberty, freedom, human rights, natural rights, all of those things? How can we claim to have those values and still, annex people and govern them against their will? Next up is China. So as far as U.S. imperialism in China, we have the open door policy. This opened Chinese markets to the United States by allowing American businesses to trade alongside European powers. So we weren't the only one practicing imperialism. Lots of other Western countries were, mostly from Europe. We were just one player. From this, we get the Boxer Rebellion. It was an anti-imperialist uprising in China that was put down by American and British forces. Moving on to Latin America, U.S. intervention in Latin America. In Cuba, we have the Platt Amendment. So the Platt Amendment allows the United States to intervene in Cuba and in their government to prevent civil unrest. So basically, whenever we thought it was necessary to intervene. And that, of course, causes resentment between the U.S. and the Philippines. Also in Cuba, we get Guantanamo Bay, the perpetual lease of a naval base. And it is still there today. We still lease that base from Cuba today. Okay? So under President Teddy Roosevelt, we have his big stick diplomacy. So Teddy Roosevelt described his foreign policy as being inspired by the West African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Teddy Roosevelt's big stick projected American naval power and increased American dominance in Latin America. Next, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So basically, it was just kind of an addition. Established the United States as the policeman in Latin America. The U.S. intervened in Latin American nations to collect debts on behalf of European nations so that they wouldn't intervene in Latin America directly. So we wanted to make sure that the Western Hemisphere, which includes Latin America, was dominated by the United States, and that the other Western powers, mostly from Europe, did not intervene. So the United States helped Panama gain independence from Colombia in order to gain access to the rights to construct the Panama Canal, which we did. Okay, under William Howard Taft, he practiced dollar diplomacy, which was all about protecting American business interests and investments in Latin America. And then Woodrow Wilson practiced moral, also known as missionary diplomacy, where he promised to only intervene to promote democratic governments and oppose non-democratic governments. Of course, he's going to intervene quite a lot in Latin America, especially in Haiti, and we're going to have some tension as well with Mexico. Okay, with 5.4, we're talking about World War I. So 1914, World War I begins. The causes of it will include the alliance system. So basically all of these different countries in Europe allying together. So as soon as one country goes to war with another, all of their allies pile on the conflict as well. And all of this is being sparked by nationalism, this kind of intense pride in your country, even at the expense of others. So where does it kick off? It kicks off in Serbia, which is in Europe. Okay. The igniting incident is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. So Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist in 1914. Following the assassination, alliances were invoked, leading to a full-scale war with Britain, France, and allies on one side and Germany and its allies on the other. From 1914 to 1917, the U.S. maintained a policy of neutrality. And of course, George Washington would have been proud of that because he promoted isolationism, right? Don't get in any entangling alliances. However, this hurt trade. Naval warfare made it difficult for the U.S. to carry on trade with Europe as a neutral power. So we get several provocations that are going to lead or prompt the U.S. to enter the war. One, we have the sinking of the Lusitania, okay, which was a cruise ship bound for Europe from the United States. It was also carrying war contraband or supplies for the war, and German U-boats sunk it. It killed several Americans, over 100. That was in 1915. So, 1916, we get the re-election of Woodrow Wilson, and his re-election slogan was, "He kept us out of war." So he was very proud of the fact that he had kept the United States out of the war, kept it neutral, and Americans liked that. Next, we've got the Zimmerman telegram, or Zimmerman note. This is from Germany to Mexico, basically telling Mexico, hey, if the United States enters the war, if you declare war on them and attack them, once we win the war in Europe, we'll come over to North America and help you defeat the Americans, and you will get all the land that you lost to them back in the Mexican-American War. You'll get all that land back. Mexico said, no thanks. Number 3, we've got unrestricted submarine warfare. So basically, American ships continue to be targeted by German U-boats, and that really is sort of the last straw. for the United States. So the United States will enter the war, and Wilson will sort of change his slogan, and he'll say that the U.S. is fighting to make the world safe for democracy. Okay? All right, so propaganda during the war, the propaganda that was released, mostly, posters, they had 4 goals in mind: to recruit soldiers, sailors, and nurses, to ration or conserve resources and food, to fund the war using the sale of Liberty bonds, and then lastly, to dehumanize the enemy, making it easier for soldiers to combat them. So some things that change in the U.S. We have the Espionage and Sedition Acts. From 1917 to 1918, the Espionage and Sedition Acts banned Americans from undermining the war effort by speaking out against the war and doing anything else, discouraging the purchase of war bonds, opposing the draft, etc., that could undermine the war effort. And of course, that was completely against the First Amendment. Next is anti-German sentiment, so against Germans, ethnic Germans. We see the name of the Frankfurter change to hot dog. So any sort of references to German culture are changed. German language is taken out of a lot of schools, and we also see the display of the German flag go away as well. Not allowed. Well, the war finally ends with the armistice on November the 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. Canada and countries in Europe celebrate that day as Armistice Day. We here in the United States celebrate it as Veterans Day. So the treaty or the peace, Wilson wanted it to center around what he called his 14 points. Okay, and a summary of those. We've got freedom of the seas, so basically trade, okay, through the ocean. Even if conflicts were going on, Wilson believed that trade should always be safe and open, and this, of course, is a response to the unrestricted submarine warfare. Reduction of arms, so decrease the size of these giant armies, these giant navies that helped spark the war. Open peace negotiations so that anyone could participate. Self-determination. And this is a big part of his 14 points, because basically it says that people around the world, especially in Europe, they should be able to determine for themselves what their government should look like. And that should be based around ethnic lines. So, for example, the Czechs should determine how they're governed. The Hungarians should determine how they're governed. Everyone should have their own country. Okay, and then number 5, which was the most important of his 14 points, or at least most important to Wilson, and that would be the League of Nations. Similar to our United Nations today, but basically the idea was that these countries, the member countries, would discuss issues and try to solve problems without the use of violence and war. So his ultimate goal with all of this was a peace without victory. Trying to get everyone to cooperate and really do something that would benefit everyone, so it doesn't feel like there's winners and losers as part of the Treaty of Versailles. So with the Treaty of Versailles, although President Wilson exercised a leadership role at the Paris Peace Conference, he had to make concessions to the Allies. So his 14 points didn't necessarily go 100% his way. So concessions to the Allies, who insisted on a war guilt clause, blaming Germany for the war and the payment of reparations. So Germany was blamed for the entire war, and they had to pay money to the Allies for that. However, the Treaty of Versailles Also included Wilson's 14 points, including redrawing new national borders in Central Europe along ethnic lines, although it failed to accommodate every European ethnic group. The treaty also created a League of Nations, which Wilson believed to be the most important thing to prevent future wars. So far, Wilson is getting what he wants, for the most part, out of the Treaty of Versailles. However, he's not the end-all to this treaty. So although President Wilson played a leading role at the Paris Peace Conference, he had an even bigger task when he returned to the United States. He had to convince the U.S. Senate to ratify the Versailles Treaty. According to the Constitution, 2/3 of the Senate must approve any treaty negotiated by the President. Wilson, a Democrat, had an uphill battle since the Republican Party had a majority in the Senate. So, factions of the U.S. Senate, we've got three. The Internationalists, which were mostly Senate Democrats, they liked the treaty as is, as it was. They didn't think they needed any changes, okay? The second group, we've got the Reservationists. They were a mixture of Democrats and Republicans, but mostly Republicans. But they felt like they could ratify it with some reservations, so like they wanted some changes. And then the third group, the Irreconcilables, were like, no way, we're not going to ratify it, and you can't really change our mind. So Republican senators opposed the treaty, believing the League of Nations, and that was the biggest part they didn't like, would obligate the United States to enter future European wars. Wilson refused to compromise with the reservationists, insisting on an all-or-nothing approach to ratification. The United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles and never joined the League of Nations, although the government did send an observer to the meetings. So because Wilson wouldn't compromise, it just didn't happen. The U.S. didn't sign the treaty, even though they worked very hard to be part of it, and they never joined the League of Nations, even though it was Wilson's idea to create it. So that brings us to the 1920s. In 1920, Americans elected Warren G. Harding, a Republican, who promised America a return to normalcy. Harding had opposed America's entry into the League of Nations, but supported America's continued involvement in efforts to promote peace and understanding in Europe, including hosting a conference that limited the size of the great powers' navies, or naval forces. All right, so Harding was basically saying we need to go back to more neutrality, more isolationism. The Dawes Plan was designed by the U.S. government to help Germany pay its war reparations while facilitating economic cooperation between the United States and Europe. Basically, we were loaning Germany money for them to pay their war reparations to Britain and France, so that then Britain and France could pay back the debt that they owed the U.S. From fighting World War I. Okay, in the 1930s, we see a change in foreign policy to the good neighbor policy. This is in Latin America. In the 1930s, the U.S. attempted to cultivate a better relationship with Latin America and get rid of the legacy of resentment from the days of U.S. imperialism. Next, we have the Neutrality Acts. Believing that America's entry into World War I was a mistake, Congress passed the Neutrality Acts to make it difficult for the president to assist belligerent nations. And remember, belligerent nations are nations at war. As a result of the Neutrality Acts, the U.S. did little as dictators began to rise in Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. So people like Mussolini, Hitler, and Stalin. And there was not much that the president, Roosevelt, okay, this is a different Roosevelt, FDR, right, could do to provide assistance to the Allies in the early days of the war. Okay, that's it for Standard 5. I'll see you next time with Standard 6.